How important in that fairness concept do you think is admitting that there are things that you don't know, to having doubt, you would know the term, I'm sure, of, that exists in journalism, of the visiting fireman, who really often, he or she, often it's a he, most often it's a he, has his story written before he arrives in the place he's written it, and he just needs a top and a dateline. How important in the fairness concept is for journalists to find room and a way to say, I don't know.
Because I cannot know. I think because that's really the thing, is that as long as you have this illusion of the knowability of society or of the world, then not knowing is failure. Whereas if you're more Socratic and say the more I learn, the more I realize how little I know, then it's actually you overcome an aspect of reality by admitting that there are things you can't know. I think the Iraq War is a good example. Most media framed it as a kind of, this group says that the Iraqis will be waiting with rice and flowers, and this group said they will be waiting with bombs and grenades. And so we'll just give 1 minute to him and 1 minute to her, and then a few more minutes, and that's it. Coverage would really have changed if we said, well, of course, we cannot know how Iraqis will react. They've been brainwashed for 30 years, they're traumatized even longer. There are no opinion polls. Anyone who would put this question to Iraqis would be killed, and then the person it was put to would be killed too. So we don't know. So what are the scenarios? And if we put this question consistently to the American government, I think that at some point they would have had to admit, we don't have a scenario. So maybe, hopefully, if it starts happening, that people will discover, wow, that actually yields much better results. With Uruzgan, the Afghan province, where both your and my country is fighting. Actually, your country is fighting, and we're waiting for another country to take over, which is called the Dutch approach. I think coverage that says we cannot know what ordinary people think in Uruzgan, because if we could, it would mean there's the rule of law, and we wouldn't have to be there. So we cannot know. So the traditional methods of journalism is to basically take society as it is, and then find the opinion polls and see which political party is popular and which paper is popular, and try to distill some sort of idea where public opinion is going. It doesn't work. But this is what people hear on the radio. And we have found 100 people who live in Australia or in Holland with family in Uruzgan, and we've asked them over a period of 5 months to put these questions to them. Mainly, what do you think these soldiers are doing? And what we've noticed over these 5 months is that certainly after this and this event, it changed in this direction. And so I think once you acknowledge the impenetrability of the world, you can then tell your readers why you engage in unorthodox forms of journalism. But that's only possible after you've allowed for the fact that some things cannot be known, especially not in systems that are not organized around transparency.
Are there, what do you think the impact has been of the growth in new media, of citizen journalism, of websites doing news, of there's a whole plethora of these things all across the world, including in the Arab world. What effect is that having on the seekers of truth for what is going on in that part of the world?
I think it's really early days. I think it addresses some of the problems, at least partly. It doesn't address others. So in Iran, with all this Twitter and Facebook, which was great, but the regime didn't Facebook. And so we got the monopoly was broken in terms of the supply of information, because it was no longer only those 4 camera teams from Reuters that were sending pictures into the world, which was great. But on the other hand, there was such imbalance between what one group supplied and the other group supplied, that this again fed back into coverage. I mean, CNN, at least CNN International in the Netherlands, seemed to be only about, well, what have we gotten from Twitter and Facebook the past hour, and is it reliable? And so it did address some of the problems, because the regime would probably have, 20 years ago, have shut down any kind of communication with the outside world. It didn't address the fact that this multiplicity of narratives, we still failed at presenting the regime. Then again, we could have done it this time because the regime is now beaming its own propaganda into the world. With Salam Pax, the Iraqi blogger, who would refute American claims on his blog, and which was read, I think, by every Middle East correspondent, who then sort of worked the stuff back into a story that made it seem as if you knew more than you did. That really helped. In Syria, when I was there last time, a year ago, it was fascinating. You could get on Hotmail now, on Gmail, which wasn't possible a couple of years ago. You could not get on YouTube, because YouTube is really explosive. Some Egyptians have filmed an Egyptian getting sodomized in a police station and put it on YouTube. Now that's really wonderful. On the other hand, we've gone through the facts. Every journalist has done a story how facts are going to bring democracy to the Arab world. Then we did satellite television. I did a piece about how satellite television would bring democracy to the Arab world, and then internet, and now new social media. Every once in a while, every few years, we like to think that technology is going to clear up this misunderstanding of a dictatorship. And what we don't see is that a dictatorship is not a misunderstanding, it's a coalition of psychopaths and mafia leaders and thugs who are pillaging their own place. And when a new media arrives, they're actually quite happy, because usually new media leave traces, digital traces. So the Iranian regime can now just go and pick off anyone who contributed anything to Twitter and lock them up. In Jordan, you pay a surcharge on every mobile phone call because the Secret Service had to expand, and it had to be paid for. And the biggest winner in terms of the internet is Al-Qaeda. They've managed to take their entire recruitment online. So, yeah, I don't see where it's going, but it's certainly moving. But I don't think, ultimately, it will address even half of the problems inherent in representation, because these just have to do with the human brain.
Can you imagine, given everything that you have said and a certain amount of pessimism that you have about journalism being able to address some of the issues that you've raised in your book, and I think they're, as I said, I think they're very important issues. Nevertheless, there's always a nevertheless. Is there an alternative to journalism?
No, it's North Korea. That's the alternative. I've lived in Egypt long enough to know that really anything is better than what they have. But it's a miserable state of affairs if you have to sort of bring that argument in. And it's funny that we live in an information society and the time of globalization. So if Americans can take out mortgages, even though they will never be able to pay for it, in the end I pay for it through my taxes, because the Dutch banks were forced to invest in it. And if some Thai farmer doesn't wash his chickens right, we may get a pandemic. So we are incredibly interconnected, and more it's all about information, and yet the quality sources of information, they have fewer and fewer subscribers, and those subscribers are getting older and older. So it may be that somehow people don't realize how important information is. It may also be that we are still presenting the world in genres of journalistic genres that are just outdated because of technology, also because the world has changed. I think the fact that you send out a correspondent on a national basis, I think it really grew out of the Cold War, when the overarching conflict was between America and the Soviet Union. These were states. And so anything that happened essentially in the world either resonated on that conflict between states or the underlying ideological conflict. These days, I think the big issue why I read a paper is no longer to find out who's in charge in Spain or in Australia. It's themes. So it's pandemic diseases, it's water, it's energy, it's the financial situation, immigration. And so if I'm interested in whoever won the election in Nigeria, it's no longer because that feeds back into this ideological struggle. It is because, is this going to be a better leader who will set his country on the right foot, so it will impact on water shortages, immigration, that sort of thing. So I think it would make really a lot of sense to start correspondenthood, or turn correspondence into thematic correspondence. So since 6 months, I'm the electric car correspondent of my paper. And,
really?
Yeah, and I'm trying to answer the question, is the electric car a good idea? And with that question, I'm going to the political structure. So I'm not waiting for all these media moments of summits or scandals or attacks by one politician against another that have all gone through these PR machines that are now so big. But I take a question, and if a minister refuses to answer them, that's also news for me. This incredible technology seems on the verge of breaking through, and the minister doesn't even have a position. This is a very different story from the opposition says this and then the minister says nothing. Because the opposition only says this in order to create this sort of storyline. And so I think that would be great if, I think on the New York Times op-ed pages, there are already sort of correspondents like this, like Nicholas Kristof, who goes to the third world a lot and basically takes his own indignation, bewilderment, surprise, and asks you to go along. And I build a kind of a parasocial relation with him. And I trust him. And so I'm interested. I think a next step could be that he would also try to raise money. And then when he spends it, also does journalism on that. There was a fantastic little project of a Dutch journalist who went to Malawi, because he did Africa and he had done one too many summits of fighting poverty. So he went to this little village, which he just picked arbitrarily, and said, "People, why are you poor?" And they told him, which was amazing. It was just fascinating to hear some people from Malawi actually reflect on their own poverty. So he came back, he did the story, and then readers started giving money. They actually called up and said, "Look, can you open an account? Because we want to give money to these people." So then the journalist collected the money, took it to Malawi, handed it out, and wrote what happened to the village when the money was handed out, which was disastrous. Because the industrious people were like, "What's this? I've been working an entire year to get 2 of these pockets of bags of maize, and now this guy comes in and he brings in 4 for even the loafer over there who was always drunk." Which again taught me so much more about development aid than another interview with an expert who says, "Well, I have the magic formula." And so it's funny how journalism has become divorced of activism, and maybe we can reconnect those. And if I've given a little money to a project, I'm much more interested to find out if it's going to work. Of course, you bring in a whole host of new problems with this.
It's very interesting. I'm going to allow you to ask a question, but on that issue of journalism and activism, there's a downside, of course, to what you're talking about. And let me point you to one downside. Fox News is an activist. I don't know whether you call it journalism, but it's certainly an activist. It calls itself a cable news service. But if you see what it's doing right now in terms of Obama's health plan, it is organising protests. Yeah. It's organising town hall meetings. It's urging people to come to Obama town hall meetings with guns. It's very activist. Yeah. It knows its audience. It's growing in. I think its ratings have gone up. Yeah. I worry that that's the future of journalism. Yep. That Fox is the model. Yep. That others are going to follow.
Yeah. Yeah, but I think in a sense, because of course Fox is just, you don't even want to mention them in a way. It feeds back into my country too. We have now politicians who just take their cue from Fox, and on the other hand, when they call the New York Times liberal media, they are correct in the sense of the word liberal that it's used in the US, because the selection of topics and the angles taken on those topics are liberal. The New York Times is in favor of the abortion. And so in a sense, I think it serves as a wake-up call, and it may actually reinvigorate the New York Times if it would be explicit about all the things it now keeps implicit. And so maybe, bring guns would not be a real New York Times thing with there. They're forced to do this, I think, in the end. Because they're being wiped away. If you posit an untruth, that takes 10 seconds, and if you want to refute it, it takes 10 minutes. So you lose. I just hope that Fox will not come to Europe. Rupert Murdoch does not own a single newspaper in my country. Maybe that's why I'm so naive.
I think that might be true. I might open it up to questions. Please keep your questions brief. Don't make speeches if you can help it.
I'm just wondering if you could tell us a bit more about how your ideas work in practice. For example, if you're talking about reporting of human rights abuse in Israel, I can't imagine it starting out with a paragraph or having a footnote. By the way, you should keep in mind that there's human rights abuses happening in neighbouring countries, but we don't have as much access to what's going on there.
Yeah, good point. Could everyone hear that? Yeah. Well, I think one of the ideas I have, or I would propose, is to introduce an extra genre, which would be the foreign editor talking you through the past 24 hours and connecting that to the rest of the page. So I would love to read a well-written column every day by the foreign editor saying, well, we've decided to open again with Iraq, because on the one hand it's very repetitive, on the other hand it's oil, it's Iran, it's Obama. So again, because there was a big bombing. Then we have our population growth correspondent went to Iran, because interesting thing, last week he was in Yemen, where the population keeps on exploding in spite of all the Dutch development aid. And in Iran, women now have fewer children than in France. So we may be missing out on something, and that's why we send him to Iran. We would have liked to send him to North Korea too, but they don't let us in. And this is such a shame, because North Korea sacrifices about 100,000 people every year to its nuclear ambition. There's also a piece about human rights violations in Israel. Ta-da-da. You see, so I think a problem is never solved in the structure that produced the problem. So if we can never allow for the subjectivity in those objectivity suggesting genres of news, analysis, feature. So we need extra stuff. And it would be very interesting if some paper would start such a column. Answer. That was the answer.
Can I just add one thing on that? It would be very interesting if a foreign editor could do that. It would also be incredibly interesting, and it will never happen, if an editor could actually write a column and say, I'm not going to, we are not going to cover what's happening in the Congo because we don't think we could sell it in newspapers if we did that in a big way. And in fact, we know from research or from guessing that if we have a piece about the Middle East, about the Palestine-Israel conflict on the front of our feature section, we might actually sell a few extra papers. But if we put Congo on that front, we won't. And that's why we're not going to cover Congo in any big way.
But I think actually a lot of readers of quality papers, because they're not blind to the rest of society, and I'm not sure that they would take it personally, even though you would tell them, research shows you're not reading it. You can even sort of fudge it a little bit by saying you would of course read it, but then the other readers of our paper wouldn't.
Well, I agree with that. I think we actually should be honest about some of those things. One of the things that I was told constantly by marketing people at the Age, for instance, was that stories about that got big display that were about Aboriginal issues didn't sell the paper. You could bet that your circulation would go down that day. People weren't interested. Now, of course, I tried to resist that. I didn't take that, but it was always in the back of my mind. And I actually agree with you. I think that you should have both a foreign editor that explains why he or she have made the choices they've made today, and an editor who occasionally was honest with their readers about why they've chosen to cover some things and not others.
And there are always two possibilities. When marketing people tell you that the story about the Aboriginals didn't work, it could mean that people are not interested in Aboriginals. It could also mean that they're not interested in the kind of stories that are done about Aboriginals.
Absolutely true.
And so I think if you would come out to your readers and say, general sort of classical journalism about Congo doesn't work, and that's why we did this. We got this fiction writer, and we sent him to Congo, and he's sending a weekly column about his life there. Actually, that may be very interesting for people who already have parasocial affection for that writer. So, we should give up
I agree.
only after.
I think you should be an editor of a newspaper.
Yeah, so
There'll be jobs going in Australia.
yeah, it's one of the questions I struggled with so much because at least in my country, the past 60 years since World War II, all this money has been poured into education and raising awareness and all that stuff, and it doesn't quite seem to have any effect. And so do you want another 50 years of trying this, and what new methods do you have? But if you don't, then the whole idea of democracy is that people are prepared and capable of forming an informed opinion when they cast their ballots. Maybe the painful truth is that somehow we need to accept that just half the population is somehow not given to them, or they just won't understand, they can't understand. This is totally taboo, by the way, so I didn't say this. But if you listen to politicians, to marketing people, to publishers, to journalists, everyone just accepts this fact that at least 50% of the population is they call it low information voters, I'm told. So, yeah, we can try another 50 years to educate them or take the vote away, and neither seems terribly attractive, especially coming from Europe, where we had a few systems where the vote was taken away.
Couple of questions. Some of what you're saying is wrong with journalism appears to be about transparency. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about using fixes, and if that is necessarily always bad, or if people are transparent about it, would that be okay? And secondly, how do you think foreign coverage is going to be financed in the Netherlands in the future?
Yeah. Right, so a question about fixers and about the financing of the news. Fixers, it was one of the discoveries I made. One was that hardly any Western correspondent knows Arabic, so they talk about people that they cannot talk with. And another one was that if you live in Cairo and you go to Yemen, what do? It's a closed system. So you have this, colleagues give you this list of people and they're fixers, and they set up appointments with experts. And if you don't know the language, they also translate for you. And there are serious problems with this. One is that fixers know English, and, well, it happened to me, if you know English, you begin to develop sympathy for the English-speaking peoples. And it comes with the capacity. And so those fixers are hardly ever fair to the fundamentalists. Hardly ever. Actually, they really hate the fundamentalists, usually. So on their list, there are no fundamentalists, and if they're fundamentalists, they are the kind of crazy-eyed fundamentalists you go to if you really don't want to know what they really think. And so, no, I think that would be the death of your article. I think if journalists would be honest about fixers, there would be an uproar. So, no, I'm afraid the solution comes from another angle, which is we should invest way more in educating our correspondents so they actually know the language. That is very tough because there are damn many languages, and then there are dialects. Even in my country, in 250 kilometers, people in the south cannot understand people in the north. And that is one tiny little silly country. Still, no, I think fixers, it would destroy any kind of credibility. Maybe only in a sort of travelogue, where there was once the BBC did a story about the fixer. Now that was very interesting. Now how would that extra education be financed? It's one of the hopeful things is say in the last 30 years you had this humongous PR industry that grew, and then now in every Western country there are more PR people than journalists. At the same time, something called the speaker circuit has come up, and it's amazing what companies and also ordinary people are prepared to pay in order to see someone they have developed parasocial affection for. And so far, what we've done is that media pay salaries to journalists, and then when the journalists go out on the speaker circuit, they get to pocket all that money. And maybe there's future in the model of the music industry, where you give away your article more or less for free, and then you get your money from the speaker circuit. Someone like Thomas Friedman charges $60,000 per lecture. Now you can pretty much hire a researcher for a whole year for $60,000. So there is all sorts of money sloshing around that we haven't managed to attract. So maybe some of the money can be found there. I sometimes do these moderator jobs, and it's funny that they usually now take people they know from television, parasocial faction, but it would be good to have actually experts who moderate and who perhaps make their money from the moderating and then are attractive as moderator because of the work they do, which they more or less give away for free. So you need serious thinking out of the box for it. And in America there's now this system of saying, listen, we really want to go do some investigative journalism about the power plant who has been leaking into the river, and we think we need about $30,000. And they fundraise. And if they have $30,000, they do the research and then they call a press conference and they hand out the information for free, which is another model. That's right, so it's Al Jazeera, and would the outcome of the Iraq War have been different had Western media portrayed the situation differently? That's difficult to say, but I really wanted to understand why my colleagues in the Netherlands were not able to summarize the arguments I made coherently. And so I read up on neuroscience. I thought maybe there's no such thing as a marketplace of ideas. Maybe there's a marketplace of emotions. And when my colleagues read the book, they feel emotionally attacked, and so they don't want to, their brain shuts off. And yes. So I don't know if the outcome would have been different, because I think large issues like that are to a large extent portrayed as emotions, as a kind of, are you for democracy or not, or are you against American imperialism or not, and that's really the reptile brain. But I do think that part of the opinion forming elites who knew nothing about the Arab world, who had never been to Iraq, would not have bought the idea that you can bring democracy to a place like Iraq had they known more about the nature of dictatorship and how a dictatorship survives by destroying civil society. So the idea that you then reintroduce a system and civil society will spring up like a sort of a flower that needs just a little bit of water, that was just so... I know that many of the Western media that came out in favor of the Iraq war, their Arab world correspondents, and usually also their Israel correspondents, were against it. Also really major publications. I think it would have been difficult to imagine the same outcome had we told time and again our audiences, look, the Iraqis that we get to speak to, they're wondering why would America bring democracy to Iraq when it's supporting the enemies of democracy in Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco. It's kind of funny, why not start there? If you have a client regime in Egypt, maybe start democracy there. You know, you don't need a war to begin with. At that point, I think if that would have, maybe Christopher Hitchens then would have seen the light a few years earlier. Al Jazeera, it solves some of the problems. I think when it comes to dictatorships, I would really not want my paper to send someone with family in that country to report on that country. Because dictatorships are they're like mafia people. They don't stop at your family when they threaten you. And so Al Jazeera employs a lot of people who are locally connected in family ways, and that makes them extremely vulnerable. And it happens all the time. I mean, Al Jazeera doesn't talk about it, but the way they get harassed and their family members, their employees get harassed, and it impacts their coverage too. I think what I really like about Al Jazeera English is that they often bring on Arab experts on issues that have nothing to do with the Arab world. And then time and again I realize I'm so used to when I see an Arab, it means there's a problem, and this Arab either is the problem or is seen as useful in solving that problem, and that problem is Islam, women, or terrorism. And then suddenly you have this guy who's trying to fight malaria in sub-Saharan Africa, some Jordanian. And it's wonderful to see an Arab who's qualified and who's just concerned with making the world better and not having to do anything with Islam. So it's definitely an addition to the palette.
So it's a great pleasure to be in the company of somebody with a supple mind who's concerned to try to establish the truth about what's going on around us. So on behalf of all of us, thank you very much, Joris.